Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing an if you like this try that, specifically for if you liked Expedition 33, you might like these stories as well. A few things to note before we jump into it. Obviously a lot of us have come away from Expedition 33 appreciating a variety of different things about it, and thus I wanted to ensure that the recommendations match that. We're going to have 4 different categories. One of them is going to be grief and or familial trauma. We're also going to be looking at stories where the world and the stakes feel somewhat similar. We also are going to explore stories that really dive into the question of what it means to be alive and also have a component of what is even going on. And then the 4th category is just an other category. This one is going to feel very random and very different, but I'm also really zeroing in on one specific aspect of Expedition 33 that if you liked it, you might like the things in this other category, but it's going to be the least one-to-one. After that, also, I need to note that if you haven't gotten through Expedition 33, because the story has so many twists and turns, some of these recommendations are rooted in themes explored later in the story, and I just don't want anybody to have the story ruined for them. So if you need to come back to this at a future date, please feel free to do so. I don't want anybody having anything spoiled for them. Then the last thing to say is that we are going to be looking at recommendations from a variety of different mediums, which includes video games, but also books, film, television, anime. We're going to have a mix of things, and all these will be linked in the description bar, so if you are looking to reference back to it, all the information will be linked there. Beginning with the grief and familial trauma category, the first one we're going to start with would be the film Pan's Labyrinth. I actually rewatched this movie because I thought of this movie in relation to Expedition 33 for a very specific reason, but I wanted to rewatch it to ensure that I wasn't just kind of making up this connection, and after rewatching it, I thought I definitely think there are components that make these somewhat similar. Both of them, I think, utilize horror fantasy really, really well without it feeling like the horror components are taking over, but because the stakes are so incredibly high in their world, and because these people have been forced to reckon with their own existence for so long through the Gamage, when they do risk their lives in a way that is separate from the Gamage, suddenly you're seeing just how bleak everything can truly be. That first moment when they land and there's these mysterious figures, it can become very, very violent and very frightening. The imagery is, I think, definitely leaning into horror territory. And certainly, if you've never seen Pan's Labyrinth, the fantasy elements are quite grotesque and they are horrifying. And it's very much a reflection in Pan's Labyrinth of a lot of what's going on around the story. So our main character is this little girl who, it is a historical fiction setting. Specifically, we are looking at Spain after there has been a civil war. And it doesn't seem like things have settled. There is certainly a lot of unrest. And this little girl, you pick up pretty quickly, is trying as much as possible to escape her current reality. And whether or not the things that she escapes into are actually happening or are figments of her own imagination are up for the viewer to decide. It's very much up for interpretation. But so much of the story is the fact that you very much understand that she has a lot of grief that she has dealt with from the loss of her father. She's grieving the life she used to have. The movie opens with her having to go to this new place where this individual who is known for being very, very violent is somebody who is going to be her new father. And you actually see the characters saying, make sure you call him father. And there's this little bit of resistance in her where she refuses. But then she's continuously confronted with these horrifying looking fantastical creatures who are telling her that she's this long lost princess and she needs to go on this quest. Just find yourself wanting there to be some semblance of peace throughout the film, and I think that that is very much true of Expedition 33. You wish there was an easy way out. You hate having to confront that a lot of what's happening is a result of grief and is a result of the breaking down of this family unit, as well as there being these threats that are coming in from the outside. So while the actual setups of the stories are not necessarily identical, I think some of the more abstract concepts and the utilization of horror fantasy are very similar across these two. Similarly, the book The Kingdom of Back, I think, is an absolutely perfect recommendation for if you specifically really liked the way that art is an exploration for escaping from your own reality. I have sung this book's praises for years. I think it is incredibly underappreciated, underhyped, underrated. I think it's amazing. And the setup is that you are looking at the Mozart siblings. Most people are very familiar with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, less so with his sister, who is just as talented, if not more so, in the realm of music as her brother. However, because of the restrictions on girls and women at that time, she was never really recognized at the same level as her brother. And when she's very young, her and her brother essentially go through this portal fantasy, this place called the Kingdom of Back. And a lot of what's transpiring here is somewhat rooted in folklore, and it starts out feeling very whimsical, and it actually feels very comforting. But as in the story, our main character is progressing through her actual life, this area starts to become much more dark and sinister, and she wants to continuously go to this place to escape her own reality, but at the end of the day, it's becoming just as ugly as her real existence. So it's like a mirror to her own situation. And I think there's so many things that you could easily draw comparisons just from that description from this to Expedition 33. Also, while Expedition 33 is obviously very, very French inspired, and this isn't necessarily French, I do feel like there is some overlap in some of the aspects of the setting and also the musical components, which are a part of Expedition 33 that I think a lot of us are obviously very much loving the music, but I don't think we think of the music when we think of the artistry of what the characters are actually talking about. But when you really think about it, some of those characters were musicians. So the fact that your protagonists are musicians in this as well, I think is another additional point in the camp of being something similar. From there, we have the film The Boy and the Heron, and this story is essentially like, what if Alice in Wonderland was maybe even weirder? The setup is that you're following this young boy who lost his mother at a young age, and then he has moved to the countryside. There's actually some parallels to Pan's Labyrinth. It's just not as dark and violent as Pan's Labyrinth is. But he moves out to the countryside with his father and his new mother, essentially, and the new mother is pregnant with what is going to be a young sibling of his, and he just doesn't really know how to process all of this. It feels like everyone around him is essentially trying to force him to accept that, oh, look, this is your new life now, but he never really mourned the loss of his mother or figured out how to go through that. So he's kind of stuck in this strange in-between. You are starting to explore this very odd place that he is led to through this Heron. And it actually seems like the person that is his quote-unquote new mother is also experiencing her own forms of grasping at what is real, what is not real, and her place in it all. So these two kind of come together through everything. It's a really, really fantastic movie, and one that I don't think I fully appreciated until my second watch. The themes of grief, I think, are exceptionally explored. They're just very oddly explored in this, but I think it's really, really great. Also, if you really like films from this studio, my friends and I do discussions for these various movies, and this was one of my favorite discussions just because I think people's experience from one to the next is going to vary so much. You're going to get so much, I think, mileage out of it depending on your own life experiences, your own connections to grief. And I think that Expedition 33, that's something that a lot of people find is true for them as well. How much it impacts their family and thus their entire lives. And I think The Boy and the Heron showcases that really exceptionally as well. After that, we have the story, The Last Tale of the Flower Bride. This one feels much more folklore and fairy tale-esque in that it is kind of building off of that foundation, but it's using it in a way to show how dark those stories can actually be and how much we can get lost in those things in order to escape our own situations. And the setup is that initially you are following this young man who meets this very mysterious woman. They fall in love, they get married, and she has this one stipulation about the relationship, which is that she doesn't allow him to really ask much about her past, her family, and this home that she grew up in. But after a family member is dying, they are forced to confront those things when they go to say their goodbyes. And a lot of what's transpiring in this house is very strange, very creepy. It kind of feels like if you took the manner of Expedition 33 and you had a lot of the story actually through that setting. And it is through this that you are confronting whether or not what's happening around the characters is really real or not. You are also exploring not only the mysterious woman's past, but you are also getting a little bit of details throughout about the protagonist's past and about something that happened to their brother when they were very, very young. I very much think that a lot of these, while they are, I think, really well representing tackling grief and familial trauma, I also think a lot of the ones I've mentioned can fit into the what's even going on category, because grief is such a difficult thing to reckon with, and thus I feel inevitably you do kind of find that a lot of these stories fit in that camp also. But because they are more so utilizing the disorientation to showcase what it's like to go through the cycles of grief, that's why I felt like these were better suited for this category. However, if you are somebody that finds maybe Expedition 33 was one of the first stories you ever encountered where grief was such a strong component, and you would like more of that, but you maybe don't always need it through the lens of horror fantasy or grim fairy tales, and you kind of wouldn't mind a little bit more of a straightforward approach, there are two stories that I wanted to mention that are actually contemporary romance stories of all things, but they do, at their core, really tackle grief and familial trauma. And the first one will be The 7-Year Slip. While this is contemporary romance, I actually found the romance came second to the exploration of losing a family member. And just maybe, if you feel it's important for you, you might want to look up potential triggers for this story, because there are some pretty heavy topics touched on it, despite what the bright cover might lead you to believe, and despite the fact that you think, oh, it's a contemporary romance, it's gonna be cute and happy. There are some pretty devastating aspects to this story, and I think that those are the things that made this book shine, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people really connect to this story because of. And then the other one I wanted to mention would be Just for the Summer. This is not necessarily as much in the grief as it is more so the familial trauma. I think a lot of the Desandra family in Expedition 33 really showcases people that care about each other and they want what's best for each other, but they all keep imposing onto each other what they think is best, or they keep going outside of things that are perhaps the healthiest to try and figure out how to process everything on their own, because maybe they reject what somebody else wants for them, and so they turn to something much darker or something that is perhaps just leading them to spiral and dwell. And I think a lot of how they interact with each other is pretty unhealthy, and I actually really appreciated those portrayals within this story. And this book, Just for the Summer, I do think that the love story component is quite well done, and it's cute and fun, but it's more so the relationship our main character has with her mother, and the way that she kind of continuously feels for her, is empathetic towards her, feels for what she had to go through, and in some ways continuously justifies the horrible decisions that her mother keeps making, and the reality of trying to face that perhaps your parent isn't a good one. Maybe they don't really love you unconditionally, and some of those really difficult things to grasp and deal with. And I think that there's a lot of questions that don't really get answered when it comes to the family dynamics in Expedition 33. And also the ways that you're like, oh, this isn't really a happy family. Even when they seem to care about each other, they care about each other, but they all kind of have some selfish inklings rooted in their decisions towards one another also. And you just really find, I feel like you could make a whole story, a whole book just about the toxicity of that family. So I think if you're somebody who's craving that a little bit, this book does it really, really well. Now getting into the world and the stakes category. And when I say stakes, I mean the fact that it feels near apocalyptic, if not apocalyptic, just straight across the board. So I wanted to find stories that I feel like represent that. And this next one I'm going to mention, if you don't know, even if something didn't personally end up working for my taste, I still give recommendations because we all have such different tastes and we all connect to different things. That's very true for this one. And it is such, I think, a perfect representation of a world that feels like it is just ticking by, and that would be the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. I really can't think of too many stories where it feels more apocalyptic in nature and like everything's about to fall apart than this story. You do follow different characters across, it would feel like, different timelines within the first book. You're not really sure how they're all connected. A lot of people really love to see how they're all connected as they progress through the story. So I don't want to say too much about that, but the world itself is where I'm drawing the comparisons, because this world goes through these seasons, and the 5th season, hence why the first book is titled The 5th Season. The 5th season is when there are events that transpire in the world that make it completely start over. These natural disasters are so catastrophic that it essentially wipes out all of mankind. And the few that survive then have to try to bring the world back. But they know that these seasons are recurring. And so we are, it would seem, approaching the next 5th season. And I think that's very similar to that dread you feel about the Gamage in Expedition 33, where you're like, how are they going to ever go up against this? It feels like a force of nature. It feels like there's something they could never defeat. So you kind of feel that sense of hopelessness as soon as you start the 5th season as well. Just want to know, I very easily could have put this one in the grief and trauma aspect too, but I felt like it was too good of a stakes recommendation to not have it in this spot. But really, truly, the grief components are very devastating. Next up, though, we have Final Fantasy. Of course, there was no way that I was going to do a recommendations for Expedition 33 and not acknowledge Final Fantasy. I have resisted so much trying to use the corny pun, and I can't resist it anymore. I really have wanted to say that Expedition 33 pays homage to Final Fantasy, and I know that's dumb, and it doesn't have anything to do with recommendations, but I just had to let you know that the dad joke has been sitting and stirring inside me, and I had to get it out. Anyway, I would say, I know all of you know pretty much that I love Final Fantasy X. I will say, I do think it is actually the one that is perhaps the best related to Expedition 33, and it's not just because I love it so much. I just genuinely think there's so much to it. So first off, in Expedition 33, you have the Paintress, and you have this group of people that are coming together to go on this quest to try and defeat this big bad. And then partially through, and at some point I am very aware that I'm kind of describing the progression of most RPGs, but in Final Fantasy X, you have a group of people that come together that are going to go up against this big bad in the form of what's known as Sin. And Sin is this literal creature that they believe in their world was created because of the sins of mankind. So you have these mysterious, mighty figures that often end up taking out giant swaths of people all at once. And then as they are progressing, they're realizing maybe this big bad that I'm going up against isn't the only thing that is an adversary to me. And then you're also exploring familial aspects along the way. We know the Dysandra family and how all that plays out, but then also some of the side characters, the devastation that was CL's life, the expectations that were consistently put on Lune, and then of course Mael, who's kind of related to some of the other familial things that we see. Gustav, and the idea of like this loss of all the people that he's ever cared about and loved, and trying to take on sort of this leadership role. And I think that there's a lot of parallels between various different characters. So in Final Fantasy X, of course, you are seeing a young man struggle with a father that he feels abandoned his family, and how he's always trying to have all this bravado, but really deep down, he's like this young child just craving this love from somebody who is meant to love him. You also have Yuna, who was trying to live up to the expectations of what her father did. So there's a lot to the various different characters. Of course, there are more than just those two. All the other characters have really important backstories as well. And there's just so much to these stories that is more than meets the eye. I just think in general, there's so much to them that is similar, not to mention, of course, that they are both turn-based games. And they are both monumental leaps when it comes to what gaming could do. I think Final Fantasy X, for a lot of us, given that it was the first Final Fantasy with voice acting, really wowed us. The jump from Final Fantasy IX, the way it looked, to Final Fantasy X was staggering and astounding. So there's so much just from the wow factor for Final Fantasy X at the time that it came out. And I think Expedition 33, a lot of people are experiencing a similar wow factor with that as well. They also both have phenomenal music. Next up, we have one that has some similarities in its world, and that would be A Winter's Promise. This is actually a story that was originally written in French, so you are going to see some aspects to the story that have their origins in something related to France. In this story, the world is broken apart. There was something that occurred. They don't really know a lot about it, but there was something that occurred that essentially made the world fracture. And then now you have all these floating pieces, and these floating pieces they refer to as different islands. You can almost think of them as different worlds. They can travel to different ones through airships and other such things. But you follow this character who is living in this one island, and they are marrying her off to somebody from another island. Within each of these islands, you have these different ancestor spirits that impact the culture and also the magic that people have across these different islands. And so that's why I was saying it feels like they're entirely different worlds. She is going to a new island where she is going to go where her betrothed is from. It's an entirely different place. The culture is very different. The magic's very different. And she has no idea her place within this new world. And it's very, very challenging for her. I think in a lot of ways, some of the imagery reminds me of some of the imagery from Expedition 33. There are specific moments where you're kind of seeing the in-between of reality, or reality as we know it. There's a lot of topics related to that, but the real world, so to speak, and also the painted versions. And I think there's that in-between space that feels very abstract and like you can create something out of that. And there's something about the idea of there being like these soul slivers that exist in these spaces that reminds me of the ancestor spirits and the impacts that that has on the painted world. So I think in some ways you can kind of tie that to the way that the ancestor spirits have an impact on the various different islands that they are connected to. Next up, I feel it is near impossible to talk about stories with monumental, if not apocalyptic stakes without mentioning Attack on Titan. This also falls into the category of what is even going on really, really well, because there are definitely some things that you do not see coming in Attack on Titan. But I talked about before that scene in Expedition 33 when they go to this place to try to fight the paintress, and then all of a sudden they're just met with such violence, and it feels like, oh my gosh, how are they ever going to fight back against this? And you very quickly see in Attack on Titan, when people go up against Titans, you're like, oh, they have no chance. They are never going to survive this. How are they going to survive this? And I think it's a very rare story that right from the beginning, you feel like there is no hope, that there's no chance that they are ever going to be able to defeat. That's a really hard thing, because most of the time you go into it and you're like, well, of course they're going to, right? Of course. And then the more it progresses, you're like, are they? Or am I just going to watch all of mankind die? Is that what this story is? And I kind of feel like that's a rare thing to witness, because most of the time we don't really feel that. And I think we feel that in Expedition 33, and I think we feel that in Attack on Titan. I will say, for those of you who didn't watch my progression through Attack on Titan, it took me a while to get into it. I thought it was maybe a little over the top initially, and then the more I got into it, I was like, never mind, this is amazing. So if you do give it a try, you might have to give it quite a while, which I know is a very common thing that anime fans say about anime and manga, but truly, Attack on Titan, it needs its time to establish itself, and then the more in you get, the more you realize how much you weren't noticing and appreciating earlier, and how much everything's tied together. And similarly, I think you can say things about Expedition 33 that match that. Next up, we have another story that is a recommendation that didn't necessarily work for me, but there are some uncanny parallels, so I had to mention it, and that would be the Art of Vanishing. This is more of a contemporary story. Even though there are magical components to it, it is very much rooted in our own world, and it's tackling themes and topics that are more about things that we experience in our day-to-day lives. It's just using the vehicle of almost magical realism, although things are truly, it would seem, actually happening that are fantastical. It's more so using that vehicle to get to those everyday themes. So the setup is that you're following this young woman who is working at this art museum, and then she starts to really take a liking to a lot of the paintings, one painting in particular, and then she realizes that she can actually go into said painting. And the other perspective in the story is somebody who is stuck within this painting, who has been observing her, wishing he could talk to her, and these two interact with each other. He kind of introduces his world to her, and then he cannot escape the painting. So you kind of know there's probably something that has to happen through these two people that it would seem their lives can't really intertwine. But given the whole parallels to art and painting, and also the French painting that is talked about and the impacts of that is represented in the Art of Vanishing, I definitely think, of course, there's some appreciation given, a lot of appreciation given to that in Expedition 33. This next one is more so rooted in a theory that I had. I did a whole theory video where I talked about a theory that I think is fairly possible, and then a theory that I think is probably not possible really at all, but that I still wanted to explore. So if you're interested in the theory video, I'll have it linked. but it's rooted in the idea of what I refer to as essentially painting Inception. So of course, because the very concept was kind of connected to the movie Inception, I'm going to recommend Inception. And the theory, to be brief, has to do with the idea of when Lune says, Mael is going to paint something for me because even though I can't go back, perhaps I can see things through this new painting, which made me wonder, is it possible for painted people to go into paintings? And if that's potentially possible, then is it possible that the world that Mael is from isn't even actually a real world and it's just a version of something else? And then it made me think of, again, painting Inception, that it's possible to keep going into worlds and you maybe not even being aware that you're in a fictional world, which makes you think about the grasp on reality. This is why this one also could fit in the like what's even going on category, but definitely I think Inception, there are some parallels to that concept and that theory that I'm sure I'm not the only one who thought about that. There's some parallels to the movie Inception. Last for this category, we have just in general works from Sanderson's Cosmere. Not all are created equal when it comes to their similarities to Expedition 33. One I'll mention would be Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, more so because Yumi and the Nightmare Painter was very much inspired by Final Fantasy X, and obviously if I'm seeing parallels between Final Fantasy X and Expedition 33, then by the very nature of Yumi and the Nightmares origins, it's going to have some connections to Expedition 33 as well. And Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is a lot of fun, and it's very different from a lot of other fantasy works out there. I also think you could maybe have Mistborn in this category because of the stakes that are really well established and how much you really, once again, feel like in Expedition 33 you have the Paintress, in Mistborn you have the Lord Ruler. Everything is kind of set up a certain way. Nobody really feels like there's any chance, but they still try. You know, there's that component to it, but I think the one that maybe is the most related actually would be Warbreaker. I just feel like Warbreaker's magic system reminds me of the way that they utilize chroma. In this, it is called biochromatic breath, and I want to make sure I'm not making that up. Because I said chroma, yeah, biochromatic breath. I was like, did I add something that sounds like chroma to this? No, I've read this multiple times, and I just questioned myself. The idea, though, behind biochromatic breath is that each individual has a breath, and they can give their breath to other people. They can also take breath, or at least they can accept breath from other people. And the more that you accumulate, the more that you kind of essentially have powers, and you can also make inanimate objects move. You can kind of command things, and it's actually really, really fascinating. And there's some parallels between biochromatic breath, I think, and chroma, and kind of the way that chroma allows you to sort of create things. It's not that clear, actually, in Expedition 33. It's the one mystery that I wonder if they were to make sequels, are we going to start to understand the magic a little bit more? What even is I was about to call chroma biochromatic breath, but what even is it exactly? I feel like there's some mysteries there, but there's also certainly some mysteries when it comes to biochromatic breath in Warbreaker. But in general, if you're looking for something that feels very different, very unique, I do think Sanderson's works provide quite a lot of that. Now for the category that presents the question of what does it even mean to be alive, and then also what's even going on. These two definitely go very much hand in hand. I wanted to kick this one off with some video games. So first up we have Nier. If you've never checked out the Nier games, they are absolutely having this question at the forefront of the themes as you progress through the story. By default, I'm also going to say Stellar Blade, because Stellar Blade is basically a copy of the story from Nier. And I will say, there's a lot of very legitimate criticisms for Stellar Blade, including the fact that its story is basically a copy, but the combat is so fun. The combat in that game is really fun. I know other people play that game for different reasons, but the combat's great. Anyway, Nier and this really do have that question of what does it mean to be alive, in ways that in Nier, you watch as these beings that have been programmed to try and restore the planet so that human beings can come back. You see the way that they are willing to consistently sacrifice themselves. They don't really see themselves as important figures. They are just a means to an end. But then you kind of start to see as they question this and push back against this. And part of what makes them do this is watching as essentially robots start to try to emulate human behavior. And there's a lot of things I don't want to reveal because there's some things that make these questions come even more to the forefront than some of the initial things that you are introduced to. And I just think that the way it explores it is really, really fascinating. It does it in a really cool sci fantasy setting, I would say. And then another recommendation would be Lies of P. I think Lies of P, from the start, of course, people's immediate thought is this is just Bloodborne, but with Pinocchio. And yeah, that's a very understandable thing to think. Certainly, I'm not disagreeing that it wears its inspirations on its puffy white sleeves. But as you progress, I definitely think it comes into its own a lot more. And some of the dialogue, because there's very minuscule amounts of dialogue in the story, but I am thinking specifically of this little robot that you come across, that every time you come across, you're like, oh, and it just makes you really emotional. And then also the individual that works at the front desk of this stupid main setting that you kind of return to. It's like your home base. Some of what he says is some of the most heartbreaking stuff I've ever heard in a video game, and they don't even talk that much, but when they do, you're like, no, what do you know? And you just, the question of what does it mean to be alive? And of course you are navigating this question through P is the character's name. You're navigating that question through their progression of the story as well, and there's some different endings that you can get depending on some of the decisions that you make. So I definitely think if you haven't checked out Lies of P, it's, I think, really good. I really quite like it. And now there's DLC that I need to check out because it looks fantastic. Now moving on to some books that I think really ask this question. First up, we have the Arc of the Scythe series. And this in its setup is not necessarily like Expedition 33, but the moral questions that arise I think are very similar. So the setup is that you are looking at our own world, but we have conquered death because of the medical advancements we've made, also have attained world peace. And so people have the ability to live forever. The problem is that the planet cannot house the growing population because people can still have children and are still continuing to have children. And thus, we don't really know what to do about the problem of overpopulation, and we've tried space exploration. Currently, it's not working out. So society's brilliant idea of how to manage this crisis is that they have a select group of people known as Scythes who go around and it feels like indiscriminately kill people. And when they do this, they are revered individuals and you cannot question their decision. All of the things that typically would kick in order to protect you from bodily injuries no longer kick in because the death came at the hand of a scythe. And thus, that is your permanent end if a scythe ends your life. And they are not really keeping up with the amount of people that need to die in order for overpopulation to not continue being a problem. So even though they're doing this horrible task, they're not really fixing the problem either. And the main two characters are young individuals, teenagers, who have been selected to become apprentices to a very respected scythe. And they don't want this life, but they've had it essentially thrust upon them. Plus, of all, despite how morbid that premise sounds, of all things, it's actually quite funny. I definitely think Neil Shusterman had a lot of fun having his morbid humor within that as well. Next up, we have The Bone Shard Daughter, and this series, I would say it's more in the first book that you are exploring the what does it mean to be alive. And I sadly cannot elaborate too much because a lot of the fun of this first book is trying to figure out what is even happening. And you have a few perspectives that are a little more straightforward. And the perspective where you're like, what's even going on, is a character who has lost a lot of her memories. However, she is next in line to rule. Her father is trying to ensure that she understands how to use the magic of their kingdom because it's kind of an integral part of how the entire society functions. Has to do with putting commands into bone fractures, creating these beings that do your bidding based off of these commands. And she is somebody that needs to know how to use this magic. She knew how to do it in the past, but then she had something happen where she lost her memories. So her father is trying to get her to have her memories come back, or at the very least, if they're not going to come back, they need to teach her how to use this magic again. Last, for this specific category, we have the book Piranesi. And I think a lot of people really, really like this story for the sense of perception, reality, and also just how disorienting it is, and the consistent, once again, what is even going on feeling that you get throughout this. A lot of people, I used the phrase mileage will vary earlier. I'll use that again in that I will say this one is actually one that didn't necessarily work for me, but so many people describe this as an experience, as nothing, it's like nothing they've ever read before, or even just a form of media. They've just never felt this feeling quite to the degree that Piranesi makes them feel. And so if you are looking for something where you're constantly questioning, and the writing itself is quite good, if you are looking for something where you just want to be lost in it and then come away and it's abstract and up for interpretation, and that grasp on reality and perception is very much something that shines, then there's a good chance that this one will work for you as well. As for the other category, this is going to be somewhat brief. The specific thing that ties the other category recommendations together is the idea of making a decision that has a lasting impact on things to come, or is really going to impact the end of the story. So the two video games that I wanted to recommend for this would be Witcher and Ghost of Tsushima. I think that Expedition 33 is a phenomenal game. However, I do think the idea of the decisions you make representing different philosophies, representing different themes, and also just tying together your connections with various different characters, I actually don't think that is as strong in this game as it is in these other two. I do appreciate the inclusion of it, I just don't think it's quite as earned, perhaps, is the way I would put it, as what you see in Witcher and Ghost. So in Witcher, you realize how much your decisions have an impact on things in the smallest of quests. When you first start Witcher, I think there's a lot of like, oh, it's fetch quests, go help this person. You get something off of a board. Okay, yeah, I'll deal with this problem. And then half the time, these turn into much bigger things than you were expecting, or they'll stay small, but out of nowhere, you would just be hit immediately by how devastating this is. And you also don't always know if the person who's talking to you is telling you the truth. So you're like, do I do the thing they asked? Or I feel like I gotta get more to the bottom of this. And there's always consequences to your actions. So that idea is played out through nearly everything in Witcher. As for Ghost of Tsushima, the idea of there being this questioning of a way of life and then that impacting how you play the game, the events of the game, this is just baked into Jin as a character, because the initial start of the story is the Mongol invasion of Japan, and Jin was raised by the code of the samurai, and he was raised to be honorable. The Mongols do not fight with their version of honor, and in order to protect his home, Jin has to ask himself the question, do I die with honor, or do I fight the Mongols as they are fighting us and I abandon honor? So that's a question that is in his character throughout the story, and it really, really, really impacts a lot of the decisions that you make. I can't think of another story where in a game there are multiple options, and there is an option that a lot of people who get far enough in the game, I will ask them, what decision did you make? And I understand completely both sides. Even though I had my preference, I understand why other people make the decision they do as well. And I don't really see one necessarily as like, no, here's why you're wrong, and here's why this is the better ending. It's like, here's the ending I prefer, but I also get why you prefer the other one. And I suppose maybe some people feel like that about Expedition 33. I think it's a little bit stronger in Ghost of Tsushima personally, but in Expedition 33, that's certainly present as well. So that's why, even though the worlds are completely different, the stakes are very different in these, the settings, there's so much about these that are not alike. That component of them that I really appreciated in their efforts in Expedition 33, I really feel like they shine in these two video games. That's it though for some recommendations for if you like Expedition 33, you might like some of these as well. Feel free, of course, to leave your recommendations in the comments down below. I would love to know what else to check out, because I myself really, really liked Expedition 33, so I wouldn't mind some other things that all of you are suggesting as well. I will have everything I talked about in the description in case you need to reference back to any of this information. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.